I don't explore anymore. I sold my camera gear, I deleted my forums accounts, and I burned the SD cards from that weekend. If you're listening to this, you're probably looking for coordinates or tips on how to break into the Aethelgard. Don't. It's not a request, it's a warning. There are places in this world that rot quietly, and then there are places that are waiting. The Aethelgard was waiting. It was late November when I parked my truck 3 miles down the logging road. The air was biting, that specific kind of mountain cold that tastes like iron and pine needles. The Aethelgard Resort is legendary in the Pacific Northwest urbex community, mostly because of its sheer scale. It's a brutalist monstrosity, raw concrete poured into rigid geometric shapes, jutting out of the mountainside like a gray tumor. It was built to house 2,000 guests, but it felt like it was built to withstand a nuclear blast. I hiked the 3 miles in silence. The forest was too quiet. Usually you hear birds, wind, the rustle of small animals. Here, the closer I got to the structure, the more the world seemed to mute itself. When the hotel finally broke through the tree line, it looked like a tombstone. 7 stories of water-stained concrete, rows of black, broken windows staring down like dead eyes. Getting in was supposed to be the hard part. The forums said the ground floor was sealed tight, welded steel plates over the doors, bricked-up windows. I had brought bolt cutters and a pry bar, fully expecting to spend an hour sweating over a rusted vent. But when I reached the loading dock around the back, the heavy steel service door wasn't welded shut. It was just slightly ajar, maybe an inch, a heavy rusted iron slab resting against the latch. That should have been my first red flag. Urbex rule number 1. If a sealed building is open, someone opened it. But my ego got in the way. I thought maybe another explorer was here last week. Maybe the wind caught it. Stupid. I squeezed through the gap, scraping my jacket against the oxidized metal, and stepped into the loading bay. The transition was instant. 1 second I was in the cold, fresh mountain air. The next I was submerged in the stale, pressurized atmosphere of the interior. The air inside didn't smell like rot or mildew, which is what I was used to. It smelled dry, like dust and old carpet preserved in a vacuum. I clicked on my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a cavernous receiving area. Pallets of rotting cardboard boxes were stacked high, frozen in time. I moved toward the main hallways, my boots crunching softly on the grit. This is where the liminal feeling started to set in. You know that feeling when you're in an airport at 3 a.m. or a school hallway during summer break? That sense that reality is slightly suspended. The Aethelgard was the definition of that. I moved out of the industrial backrooms and into the guest corridors of the first floor. This was the backrooms vibe everyone talks about online, but seeing it in person is visceral. Endless hallways, beige wallpaper peeling in long skin-like strips, carpets with a geometric pattern that seemed to vibrate if you stared at them too long. The silence was heavy. It wasn't just a lack of noise, it was a physical pressure against my eardrums. The only sound was the high-pitched whine of my own nervous system. I spent the first hour documenting the lobby and the ballroom. It was eerie, sure, but standard fare for an abandoned hotel. I was getting comfortable. I was getting careless. I decided to head down. The blueprints I'd downloaded mentioned a geothermal regulation sublevel below the basement. That's where the big machinery would be. That's where the good photos were. I found the stairwell behind the kitchen. The air got warmer as I descended. Not humid, just tepid. a consistent, artificial warmth that didn't match the freezing temperatures outside. I reached the bottom of the stairs, opening the fire door into a long concrete utility tunnel. It was lined with pipes, thick industrial conduits wrapped in asbestos insulation. The dust down here was thick, a gray blanket that had settled over everything for 15 years. I stopped walking. I shined my light on the floor. The dust was undisturbed, perfectly smooth. No animal tracks, no other explorer footprints, just a pristine gray sheet stretching into the dark. I walked forward, careful to step on the edges near the wall to minimize my trail. I was photographing a rusted pressure gauge when a sound made me freeze. Thump. It was dull, distant, like a heavy object dropping on carpet 3 floors above me. I held my breath, straining my ears. Old buildings make noise, they settle. Metal expands and contracts. It's just the building, I told myself. I kept moving, following the main steam pipe. It was massive, maybe 2 feet in diameter. As I shined my light along its length, I noticed something odd. About 50 feet down the tunnel, the dust on top of the pipe was disturbed. I walked over to it. There was a clean patch on the insulation, shaped like a handprint. Not a skeletal, dusty smear, but a clean swipe, as if someone had touched it today. I reached out, hovering my hand over the spot. I pulled back instinctively. The pipe was hot. Not warm, hot. My mind raced. This place had been off the grid since 2008. There was no electricity, no gas, no maintenance crew. A pipe this size, buried in a sub-basement, shouldn't be generating heat unless the boiler was active. And a boiler requires fuel. It requires an operator. I looked at the handprint again. It was small, narrow fingers. Panic started to prick at the back of my neck. The silence of the tunnel felt predatory. I turned my flashlight beam down the long, dark throat of the corridor. The pipes continued into the gloom, twisting around a corner. Then I smelled it. Cutting through the stale dust and the metallic scent of the hot pipe, a faint, distinct odor drifted from around the corner. It didn't belong here. It was too domestic, too normal. It was the smell of oatmeal, boiled oats and brown sugar. I stood there, paralyzed, the beam of my light shaking slightly. Someone was cooking, down here, in the dark. I should have turned around. I should have sprinted back to the loading dock and never looked back. But curiosity is a disease. I took a step forward, creeping toward the corner, needing to see the source of the heat and the smell. I reached the bend in the tunnel and peeked around the concrete pillar. The corridor ended in a dead end, a flat concrete wall with a single rusted service ladder leading up to a hatch in the ceiling. But at the base of the wall, there was a vent grate. The screws were missing. The grate was leaning against the wall. And from the black rectangular hole where the vent used to be, a soft amber light was flickering. Not a flashlight, candlelight. I held my breath, terrified that the sound of my own heart would give me away. I watched the hole. Suddenly, the candlelight was extinguished, snuffed out instantly. And from inside the black hole in the wall, just a few feet away from my face, a voice whispered, dry, raspy, and terrifyingly close. "I hear his boots, Daddy. I hear his boots." My brain didn't process the words immediately. It processed the tone first. That whisper wasn't fear. It was excitement. It was the sound a child makes during a game of hide-and-seek when they've spotted the seeker. I hear his boots. I didn't scream. The terror that hit me was absolute and paralyzing, locking my vocal cords. I clicked my flashlight off instantly, plunging the utility tunnel into pitch blackness. I needed to disappear. I stood there in the dark, my mouth tasting like copper, my eyes straining against the void. I listened. For a terrifying 10 seconds, there was nothing but the rushing of blood in my own ears. Then I heard a sound that made my knees water. Scrape, scrape, thump. It was the sound of the vent grate being pushed aside completely. Then came the soft, wet slap of bare skin hitting the concrete floor. One of them was out. They were in the tunnel with me. I didn't wait to hear more. I turned and moved as fast as I could without running, guiding myself with one hand against the rough asbestos-wrapped pipes. I needed to get back to the stairwell, but I couldn't sprint. If I tripped in the dark, if I made a loud noise, I was dead. I stepped with a hyper-awareness I didn't know I possessed, rolling my feet from heel to toe to muffle the crunch of the grit. Behind me, the shuffling sound grew louder. It wasn't a walk, it sounded like a scuttle, fast, uneven, and low to the ground. I reached the fire door at the end of the tunnel, squeezed the handle, and slipped through, easing it shut behind me. I didn't let it latch. The click would have echoed like a gunshot. I bolted up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, my lungs burning, my flashlight still off. I didn't stop at the ground floor. The loading dock was too far, too exposed. If they knew the building better than I did, they could cut me off. I kept climbing. 2nd floor, 3rd floor. I burst out onto the 3rd floor landing, gasping for air, and finally risked clicking my light back on. I swept the beam across the hallway. Empty. Just rows of identical doors, peeling wallpaper, and that suffocating, vibrating silence. I ducked into the nearest room, room 308, and locked the door. I dragged a heavy, rotting armchair from the corner and wedged it under the handle. Then I collapsed against the wall, sliding down until I hit the floor, shaking so hard my teeth clattered. A fugitive family, that's what my mind settled on. Squatters, meth addicts maybe, people who had gone feral in the isolation. But that voice, it hadn't sounded drugged. It sounded lucid, predatory. I sat there for 20 minutes, just listening. The hotel was silent again, but the silence felt different now. It wasn't empty, it was pregnant. It felt like the building was holding its breath. I needed a plan. I had to get back to my truck, but I couldn't go back down the way I came. I needed to find a fire escape on the exterior. I stood up, my legs feeling like jelly, and walked to the window. That's when the backroom's nature of the Aethelgard started to twist my reality. I looked out the window. It was pitch black outside, just the faint outline of the pines against the night sky. But something was wrong with the perspective. I turned back to the room. It was a standard hotel layout, a short entry hallway with a bathroom on the right, opening up into the bedroom. I paced the room. From the hallway door to the window, it was maybe 20 feet. I looked at the blueprints I had saved on my phone. The screen was cracked, but I could still read the architectural PDF. I zoomed in on the 3rd floor. According to the plan, the guest rooms were supposed to be 30 feet deep. I frowned. I paced it again. 20 feet. Where were the other 10 feet? I walked out into the corridor, flashlight trembling. I looked at the door to room 308, then looked at the door to room 310 next to it. They were close together, But inside the room, the sidewalls felt thick, too thick. I went back into room 308 and went into the bathroom. I tapped on the back wall, the wall that should have backed up to the main corridor plumbing chase. Thud. Solid concrete. Then I went to the bedroom wall, the one shared with room 310. I tapped it. Talk. Hollow, but not empty hollow. It sounded layered, like plywood over a void. I pressed my ear against the plaster. At first, silence. Then, a low rhythmic sound. Whoosh, whoosh. It was air, moving air. There was a draft coming from behind the wall. I pulled my pry bar from my belt. I knew I should be running, but this geometric impossibility gnawed at me. The fear was still there, but the confusion was overriding it. I found a seam in the wallpaper near the baseboard where the moisture had caused it to bubble. I peeled back a strip of the rotting paper. Behind the wallpaper wasn't drywall. It was a sheet of plywood painted to look like plaster. And in the center of the plywood, about 3 feet off the ground, there was a hole. A drill hole, maybe a 1/4 inch wide. It had been filled with something soft, putty or wax, and painted over. But the paint had cracked with age. I took the tip of my knife and gently picked at the plug. A chunk of dried putty fell onto the carpet. A beam of light shot through the tiny hole. My heart hammered against my ribs. I wasn't looking into room 3010. I was looking into a space between room 308 and room 310. I killed my flashlight and pressed my eye to the hole. I was looking into a narrow vertical corridor. It was about 3 feet wide, running parallel to the guest rooms. It wasn't a service chase for pipes. It was a walkway. The floor was covered in old mattresses and rugs to dampen sound. The walls were lined with shelves, canned food, jugs of water, piles of clothes. It was a secret ecosystem parasitic to the hotel's structure. And standing in that narrow corridor, bathed in the yellow glow of a battery-powered lantern, was a man. He was tall, gaunt, with a beard that reached his chest. He was wearing clothes that looked like they had been scavenged from the hotel Lost and Found decades ago. A bellhop's jacket over a flannel shirt. He wasn't moving. He was standing perfectly still, his head cocked to the side. He was holding a stethoscope against the wall, my wall. He was listening to me breathe. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. I stood frozen in the center of room 308, the darkness of the hotel pressing against my eyeballs, terrified that the slightest shift of my weight would send a vibration through the floorboards and into the earpieces of that stethoscope. On the other side of the wall, the man moved. It was a subtle sound, the fabric of his scavenged jacket brushing against the raw plywood of the secret cavity. The stethoscope head scraped across the plaster, moving 6 inches to the left. He was tracking me. He wasn't just listening for noise. He was listening for presence. He was triangulating my heartbeat like a submarine hunting a vessel in deep water. A deep, guttural voice mumbled through the wall. It was muffled, but in the silence of the Aethelgard, it was intelligible. "Rabbit is in the warren, top bunk 308. He was on a radio. Adrenaline, cold and sharp, finally broke my paralysis. They were coordinating. The sons, the ones I'd heard in the basement, were coming up. The father was in the walls, acting as the spotter.
I wasn't an explorer anymore. I was a glitch in their ecosystem, and they were the white blood cells coming to purge me. I moved. I didn't care about silence anymore. Speed was the only currency I had left. I grabbed the rotting armchair I'd wedged against the door and yanked it back. It screeched across the carpet, a sound that must have been deafening inside the wall cavity. I ripped the door open and spilled out into the third-floor corridor. The hallway stretched out in both directions, a tunnel of peeling beige and geometric carpet, bathed in the shadows of the night. But now the hallway looked different. It wasn't just abandoned architecture, it was a hunting ground. I swung my flashlight beam wildly across the walls. Now that I knew what to look for, I saw them everywhere. Small discolored circles in the wallpaper, putty plugs. They were at eye level, they were at knee level, they were spaced every 10 feet on both sides of the corridor. The entire hotel was a panopticon. They could be standing anywhere, behind any section of that wall, watching me run, and I would never see them until they stepped out. I sprinted toward the stairwell I had come up, my boots pounding on the floor. The air felt thinner, sharper. I reached the fire door at the end of the hall and slammed my shoulder into the crash bar. It didn't budge. I hit it again, harder, panic rising in my throat like bile. The bar depressed, the mechanism clicked, but the door refused to swing outward. I shone my light through the narrow wire mesh window in the door. A heavy steel chain had been wrapped around the handles on the stairwell side, secured with a padlock. They hadn't just closed the trap, they had locked the cage. "Damn it!" I shouted, the sound echoing flatly down the hall. I spun around. I was trapped on the third floor. I had to find another way down. The main elevators were dead, obviously. That left the service elevators at the far end of the wing, where the external fire escapes.
I started running back the way I came, passing room 308. As I passed it, I heard a sound that made my blood freeze. From inside the room I had just vacated, there was a loud click, followed by the groan of a hidden mechanism. A section of the wall I had just been inspecting, was sliding open. The father was coming out. I didn't look back. I pumped my arms, sprinting down the endless beige throat of the hotel. I needed a window. I needed to get to the fire escape. I banked hard around a corner, entering the north wing. This section of the hotel was in worse shape. The ceiling tiles had collapsed, littering the floor with sodden pulp, and the carpet was slick with moss. I aimed for the window at the end of the hall. It was boarded up with plywood, but the wood looked rotten. If I could hit it hard enough, maybe I could punch through to the metal grate of the fire escape outside. I was 20 feet away from the window when a shape detached itself from the shadows of a doorway to my right. It was one of the sons. He was fast, terrifyingly fast. He didn't move like a human. He moved like an animal that had forgotten how to walk upright. He was on all fours, scrambling out of a guest room, wearing nothing but filthy gray thermal underwear. His skin was pale, almost translucent, covered in grime. He didn't attack me directly. He lunged at my legs. I reacted on instinct. I kicked out, my heavy hiking boot connecting solidly with his shoulder. There was a wet crack, and he yelped, a high-pitched, feral sound. He tumbled backward into the wall, knocking a hole in the rotten drywall. I didn't stop to fight. I lunged for the window. I smashed the pry bar against the plywood covering the glass. The wood splintered, revealing the night sky. I smashed it again, clearing a hole big enough to squeeze through. I grabbed the frame and hauled myself up, cutting my hands on the jagged glass shards still stuck in the molding. I tumbled out onto the metal grating of the fire escape. The cold air hit me like a physical blow, shocking my lungs. I scrambled to my feet, gripping the rusty railing, ready to descend to the ground and run until my heart exploded. I looked down. The fire escape ended 10 feet below me. The bottom flight of stairs, the cantilever section that drops to the ground, was gone. It had been unbolted and removed. I looked up. The stairs going up to the roof were still there, but the path down was a 40-foot drop onto jagged concrete debris. Inside the hotel, through the hole I had just made, I heard the father's voice again. It was closer now, calm, almost soothing. "Don't fight it, little bird. The drop will break your legs, then the coyotes get you. Stay inside. It's warm inside." I looked at the drop, then I looked at the stairs going up. If I went down, I broke my legs and they caught me. If I went back inside, they caught me. The roof was the only place they couldn't come out of the walls. I grabbed the railing and started climbing up, the rusted metal groaning under my weight. Below, my hand, pale, dirty, and shaking with rage, reached out through the broken window, swiping at the empty air where my ankle had been a second before. I climbed into the freezing wind, leaving the suffocating corridors behind. But as I ascended, I realized I was only trading one trap for another. The Aethelgard was a tomb, and I was climbing to the top of the headstone.
The wind on the face of the mountain was a physical assault. As I scrambled up the final few rungs of the fire escape, the gale stripped the heat from my body instantly, turning the sweat on my back into a layer of ice. I vaulted over the parapet and collapsed onto the roof, gasping for air. The gravel embedded in the tar dug into my palms, but I didn't care. I was out. I was out of the walls, out of the panopticon. But as I pushed myself up and looked around, I realized I hadn't escaped the maze. I had just entered a different level of it. The roof of the Aethelgard was massive, a sprawling concrete plateau that looked less like a building and more like an industrial wasteland. It was a chaotic landscape of rusted HVAC units the size of vans, towering elevator bulkheads, and tangled forests of conduit pipes. Fog was rolling over the edge of the building, thick and gray, swallowing the far end of the roof in a soup of swirling mist. The isolation up here was crushing. Far below, miles away in the valley, I could see the faint amber glow of a distant town. It might as well have been on the moon. I stayed low, crouching behind a massive ventilation housing. The wind howled through the metal fins of the vents, creating a low, mournful moan that sounded like a choir of dying animals. It masked my footsteps, which was good, but it also masked theirs. I needed to find a way down. The fire escape I'd climbed was a dead end. I scanned the perimeter. The Aethelgard was shaped like a jagged U. If I could cross to the other wing, the south wing, maybe the fire escape on that side was still intact. I started moving, weaving through the maze of machinery. My hands were numb, my movements jerky. Every shadow that stretched from the moonlight looked like a crouching man. I passed a large square structure, the top of the main atrium skylight. The glass was blackened with grime, but through the cracks I could see the faint, ghostly illumination of the lobby 7 stories down. It was a dizzying, vertiginous drop. Then I smelled it again. Oatmeal and burning wood. The wind swirled, carrying a plume of smoke across my path. I froze, dropping to my stomach on the freezing gravel. About 50 yards ahead, near the base of the elevator bulkhead, there was a camp. It wasn't temporary, it was an established outpost. A tarp had been stretched between two ventilation units, weighted down with cinder blocks. Underneath, a metal barrel was glowing with a fire, and sitting around it were two figures. They weren't the ones I had seen inside. These were smaller. One was hunched over, wrapped in layers of filthy wool blankets, stirring a pot on the fire. The other was standing, looking out into the fog with a pair of binoculars. The family was bigger than I thought. I slowly started to back-crawl, trying to put the skylight structure between me and them. I needed to get to the south wing, but they were blocking the direct path. I would have to go the long way around, skirting the absolute edge of the roof, walking a 2-foot ledge with a 7-story drop on one side and a sheer concrete wall on the other. I reached the edge. The wind was ferocious here, threatening to peel me off the building. I gripped the flashing of the parapet, inching sideways. I made it about 20 feet when the roof spoke to me. It was a metallic clang, vibrating through the soles of my boots. It came from beneath the tar and gravel. I looked down. I was standing on a large, square metal plate, an access hatch for the maintenance shafts. Before I could step off, the hatch jolted upward. I threw myself backward, landing hard on my elbows, just as the heavy steel plate was shoved open from below. A hand shot out. It was the father. He didn't pull himself up. He just stood on the ladder rung just below the surface, his head rising out of the hatch like a periscope. His eyes locked onto mine instantly. There was no surprise in his face, just a calm, terrifying recognition. He smiled, revealing teeth that had been filed to points. "The chimney sweep," he whispered. His voice cut through the wind, clearer than it should have been. "You run very fast, little bird, but the roof is the skillet, and you are the bacon." He whistled. It was a sharp, piercing sound, mimicking a hawk's cry. From the camp across the roof, the two figures stood up. From the fire escape behind me, I heard the rattle of metal. The sons I had left on the 3rd floor had climbed up. They were herding me. They had pushed me up here on purpose. I scrambled to my feet, the father laughing softly as he began to climb out of the hatch. I ran. I abandoned stealth. I sprinted toward the only open space left, the far edge of the north wing, where the concrete ended and the fog began. I could hear them behind me. They didn't run like me. They flowed. They vaulted over pipes and scrambled up the sides of the HVAC units, moving with a chaotic, arachnid agility. I reached the corner of the roof. Dead end, just a 3-foot retaining wall, and then gravity. I spun around, my back to the void. The family slowed down. They fanned out in a semicircle, blocking my escape. There were 4 of them now, the father, the 2 feral sons, and the lookout from the camp. They stopped about 30 feet away, just out of reach of my flashlight beam, silhouetted against the ambient light of the moon. They weren't attacking. They were waiting. The father stepped forward. He was holding something in his hand, a long rusted pole with a loop of wire at the end, a catch pole, like you'd use for a stray dog. "No broken bones," he commanded the others, his voice stern. "The meat spoils if the animal is stressed. Gentle now."
He took a step toward me. I looked over my shoulder at the drop. It was suicide. I looked at the catchpole. That was torture. Then I saw it. To my left, attached to the side of the building, was a heavy industrial debris chute, one of those large plastic yellow tubes construction crews use to dump rubble from high floors into a dumpster below. It was anchored to the scaffolding on the side of the hotel. It was steep, dark, and ribbed with plastic ridges. I had no idea if it went all the way to the ground, or if it ended in a grinder, or if it was blocked with jagged rebar. But it was a hole, and rats survive by finding holes. The father lunged, the wire loop swinging for my neck. I didn't hesitate. I vaulted over the parapet and threw myself into the yellow mouth of the chute.
The descent was a violent, suffocating blur. The moment I threw myself into the chute, gravity took over with terrifying aggression. It wasn't a smooth slide. It was a chaotic tumbling through a ribbed plastic throat that smelled of wet rot and pulverized gypsum. My flashlight spun wildly, creating a strobe effect against the yellow walls of the tube as I careened downward. I was sliding on my back, then my side, then tumbling head over heels. The ridges of the chute battered my ribs and elbows. I tried to brace my legs to slow down, but the plastic was slick with condensation and grime. I was a bullet in a rifled barrel, picking up speed with every passing second. The chute curved sharply, a brutal, jarring banking turn that slammed my head against the plastic, and then the floor dropped out completely. I fell. I was airborne for a split second before I slammed into something that yielded with a crunch. The impact knocked the wind out of me instantly. I lay there, gasping, my vision swimming with black spots as a cloud of choking white dust billowed up around me. I wasn't on the ground. I was in a mountain of trash. I scrambled to sit up, coughing up drywall dust. I clicked my flashlight on, the beam cutting through the suspended particulate matter. I was inside a massive, rusted roll-off dumpster. It was filled halfway with construction debris, broken sheetrock, twisted metal studs, and sodden ceiling tiles. The chute ended directly above me, a gaping maw hanging over the dumpster's edge. I froze. Above me, deep inside the plastic throat of the chute, I heard a sound. Zzzt. The friction of fabric against plastic. Someone else was coming down. Pain flared in my left shoulder. I had landed hard on it, but I ignored it. I scrambled over the shifting pile of trash, desperate to get over the metal lip of the dumpster before the next body hit the pile. I grabbed the rusted rim and vaulted over, dropping 5 feet onto wet concrete. I hit the ground rolling and scrambled behind a stack of wooden pallets. A second later, a figure shot out of the chute. It wasn't a man. It was a cinder block. It slammed into the trash pile with a deafening thud, right where my head had been 10 seconds ago. Then came the laughter. It echoed down the plastic tube, distorted and metallic. The father was playing games. He was flushing the rat out of the pipe. I didn't stick around to see what came next. I scanned my surroundings. I was on a service terrace, a concrete loading deck jutting out from the second floor of the hotel. To my left was the forest, a 40-foot drop into the darkness. To my right were the double doors leading back into the belly of the beast. I had no choice. I pushed through the doors. I stumbled into a new kind of hell. This wasn't the guest wing. This was the industrial heart of the hotel, the commercial laundry sector.
The space was cavernous, illuminated only by the weak moonlight filtering through high, grime-coated windows. Rows of massive industrial washing machines stood like iron monoliths, their glass doors gaping open like hungry mouths. Giant dryer tumblers, big enough to hold a crouching man, lined the far wall.
The air here was different. It smelled of ancient chemical detergent and something organic, something musky and spoiled. I moved through the aisles of machines, my footsteps silent on the damp concrete. I needed a weapon. I needed an exit. But mostly I needed to understand the geography so I didn't run into a dead end. I reached the center of the room, where long sorting tables were arranged in a grid. Piles of linens were stacked there. I shined my light on the nearest table. My stomach dropped. It wasn't hotel linens. It was clothes, hundreds of them. There were piles of denim jeans stiff with mold, mountains of flannel shirts, hoodies and hiking jackets. There were distinct piles for boots, hiking boots, sneakers, rain boots, lined up in pairs, cleaned and polished. This wasn't just a pile of refuse, it was a store. I walked to the next table. Here the organization was more specific. Electronics. A pyramid of old digital cameras, the batteries long dead. A stack of flip phones. A row of dusty Garmin GPS units. And next to that, a plastic bin filled with wallets. I stared at the bin. My hand trembled as I reached out and flipped open the top wallet. A leather bifold swollen with moisture. The driver's license was faded, but the face was clear. A young guy, maybe 20. The issue date was 2011. I opened another. A woman from Oregon, 2014. Another, a man from British Columbia, 2019. This wasn't a family of squatters defending their home. This was a multi-generational trap. The Aethelgard was a Venus flytrap, and the structural instability that closed it was the best thing that ever happened to them. They had been harvesting curiosity seekers for 15 years. A sound snapped me out of my horror. Squeak, squeak, squeak. It was the rhythmic sound of a wheel needing oil. It was coming from the far end of the laundry room, from the dark corridor that led to the service elevators. I killed my light. I ducked behind a massive canvas laundry cart, peering through the wire mesh. A beam of yellow light swung into the room. Walking down the aisle was the son I had kicked on the third floor. He was limping, favoring his left leg. He was pushing a yellow janitorial cart. But he wasn't alone. Walking next to him was a woman. She was huge, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a filthy floral dress that looked like it had been made from curtains. Her hair was a matted gray mane that hung to her waist. She was holding a large, heavy pair of fabric shears. They stopped at the sorting table I had just left. The woman picked up the wallet I had dropped. She sniffed it. She turned her head slowly, scanning the dark room. Her eyes reflected the little light available, shining like a cat's. "He was here," she croaked. Her voice was deeper than the father's. It sounded like stones grinding together. "The heat is still on the leather." The son with the limp hissed, pointing toward the rows of washing machines. "Find him," the mother said, raising the shears. "Do not cut the coat. The coat is good Gore-Tex. We need Gore-Tex for the winter." They split up. The son started checking the dryer tumblers, opening the doors one by one. The mother began walking down the main aisle, stabbing the shears into the laundry carts as she passed them. Thunk into a pile of sheets. Thunk into a pile of towels. She was coming toward my cart. I looked around frantically. I was cornered. If I ran, they'd see me. If I stayed, she'd skewer me. I looked behind me. Directly behind my cart was a metal chute set into the wall labeled Linen Return, Gravity Fed. It was barely 18 inches square, a dark metal throat leading to the basement levels. The mother took a step closer. She raised the shears, the blades gleaming in the moonlight. Thunk! She stabbed the cart next to mine. I didn't have a choice. I couldn't fight her with those shears. I unlatched the small metal door of the linen chute, praying it wasn't locked, praying it didn't lead to a compactor. It swung open with a silent hinge. I squeezed my shoulders into the hole. It was tight, terrifyingly tight. I had to exhale fully to fit my chest through. As I wiggled my hips into the darkness, the mother stopped. She sniffed the air again. "Little bird," she whispered, right on the other side of the canvas cart. I pulled my legs in and let go, sliding head first into the pitch-black throat of the building's plumbing, sliding deeper into the earth, just as the sound of metal shears tearing through canvas erupted above me.
The slide was a vertical coffin. I was plummeting head first, my arms pinned to my sides by the narrow metal diameter of the chute. It smelled of mildew and ancient coagulated soap, but underneath that was a darker, iron-rich scent. The ride lasted only 5 seconds, but in the pitch black, disoriented by the rush of gravity and the scraping of metal against my jacket, it felt like an eternity. I shot out of the bottom like a cannonball. I didn't hit concrete. I hit a soft, damp mound that swallowed me whole. I thrashed, panic flaring as something heavy and wet wrapped around my face, suffocating me. I clawed my way upward, gasping for air, and erupted from the pile. I was in a wire mesh cage, about 10 feet square, filled with rotting linens that had been dropped down this chute years ago and left to fester. The smell was abominable, ammonia and decay, the scent of a wet dog times 1,000. I scrambled over the mound of gray sheets and vaulted the side of the cage, landing on a grate floor. I fell to my knees, retching, wiping the slime from my face. I clicked my flashlight on. I was in the geothermal regulation sublevel, the belly of the beast. If the upper floors were the Aethelgard skeleton, this was its organs. The space was colossal, a cathedral of engineering carved out of the mountain rock. The ceiling vanished into darkness 50 feet above, crisscrossed with catwalks and gantries. The floor was a maze of massive pumps, turbines, and pipes thick enough to drive a car through. And it was loud. The silence of the upper floors didn't exist here. The air vibrated with a low-frequency thrum, wub, 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 that rattled my teeth. It was the sound of the geothermal turbines, still spinning, still drawing heat from the earth, powering nothing but the family's survival. It was sweltering. The temperature must have been 90 degrees. The air was hazy with steam escaping from rusted valves. I moved away from the laundry cage, sticking to the shadows of the massive turbines. I needed to find a way out. This level would have an external service exit, a tunnel for maintenance vehicles, or a ventilation shaft leading to the surface. As I navigated the maze of pipes, I realized the extent of their infestation. The industrial space had been colonized. I passed a section of piping where the insulation had been stripped away. Copper wires were spliced into the junction boxes, running along the floor like black snakes, leading to makeshift floodlights and hot plates scattered throughout the room. They were siphoning power directly from the turbines. I turned a corner around a massive heat exchanger and stopped dead. I had found the pantry. It was a section of the room enclosed by chain-link fencing. Inside, hung on hooks welded to the overhead pipes, were rows of things. At first, my brain refused to categorize them. They looked like sides of beef you'd see in a slaughterhouse freezer, but the shape was wrong. Long, thin limbs, rib cages. They were deer, dozens of them, some fresh, dripping blood into plastic buckets, some dried and blackened like jerky. But in the back row, behind the deer,
There were shapes that were distinctly not deer. I didn't shine my light directly on them. I couldn't. I kept the beam low, letting the ambient spill illuminate the horror. There were boots on the floor beneath them. Hiking boots. I turned away, bile rising in my throat again. The sons weren't just feral, they were hunters. And the father was the butcher. I forced myself to keep moving. I couldn't help them. They were long gone. I needed to survive. I spotted a heavy steel door on the far wall, stenciled with emergency exhaust, north. That was it, the way out. I crept toward it, moving step by step across the metal grating. I was 30 feet away when the door opened. I dove behind a generator housing, pressing my face against the vibrating metal. The father walked in. He looked different in the light of the engine room. Up close, he was even more terrifying. He was shirtless, his skin slick with sweat and grime, revealing a map of scars and tattoos that had blurred with age. He was wearing a welding apron stained black with old blood. He wasn't alone. He was dragging something. It was a sled, a makeshift travois made from metal conduit and wire mesh, and strapped to it was a pile of scavenged goods, batteries, copper wire, and my backpack, the one I had dropped when I fled the 3rd floor. He was humming, a low, discordant tune that harmonized with the thrum of the turbines. He stopped at a workbench near the center of the room, not 20 feet from where I was hiding. He picked up my backpack and upended it onto the table. My camera, my lenses, my water bottle, it all clattered onto the steel. He picked up my camera, a high-end DSLR. He turned it over in his massive, dirty hands, examining it with the curiosity of an ape and the intelligence of an engineer. He popped the SD card out. He walked over to a computer tower that was rigged up to a car battery bank in the corner. A heavy CRT monitor flickered to life. My heart hammered against the generator housing. He was checking the footage. He wanted to see what I had seen. But that wasn't the worst part. As the monitor glowed blue, illuminating his face, he picked up a microphone, a CB radio mic hooked into the hotel's old intercom system. He depressed the button. His voice boomed through the speakers mounted on the walls of the sub-basement, echoing like the voice of God. Caleb, Silas, Mother. The voice was distorted, crackling with static. The rabbit has a name. His name is looking at me right now. He held up my wallet, which the mother must have given him. He read my ID. He is from the city. He has no one waiting for him, no wife, no little ones. He paused, looking directly at the camera monitor, watching the footage I had taken of the secret room. He knows the layout. He found the vents. The father turned slowly, scanning the room. He didn't know exactly where I was, but he knew I was down here. The laundry chute was the only way down from the 2nd floor that didn't go through the stairs. "Seal the north exhaust," he commanded into the mic. "Open the steam valves in Sector 4. Flush him out." My blood ran cold. The door I was aiming for, the north exhaust, was about to be sealed. And Sector 4. I looked at the pillar next to me. A faded yellow number was painted on the concrete. 4. I was in Sector 4. Above me, the pipes began to groan. A pneumatic hiss started, low at first, then building to a shriek. They were venting the geothermal steam directly into the room. I had seconds before this section of the basement became a pressure cooker. I looked at the father. He was busy at the computer, his back partially turned. I looked at the north exhaust door. It was still open, but I could hear the heavy electronic lock mechanism grinding, engaging slowly. I had to run. I had to run right past him. I tightened the grip on the pry bar. It was suicide, but staying here was death by boiling. The steam erupted. A white scalding cloud blasted from a vent 10 feet above my head, instantly filling the space with blinding fog.
I used the chaos. I surged forward, sprinting out from behind the generator, aiming for the closing door. The father spun around. He saw the movement in the steam. "There!" he roared. He lunged, grabbing a heavy wrench from the workbench. He was fast, but the steam obscured his vision. I ducked under his swing, the wind of the heavy iron tool whistling past my ear, and shoulder-checked him. It was like running into a brick wall. He barely stumbled, but the impact knocked me sideways. I scrambled for footing on the slick grate, diving toward the door. The gap was closing. 2 feet, 1 foot. I threw myself through the opening, scraping my ribs against the moving steel slab. Clang! The door slammed shut behind me. I lay there in the cool, dark tunnel, gasping for air, listening to the muffled roar of the father screaming in rage on the other side. I was out of the boiler room, but as I raised my flashlight to see where I was, I realized the nightmare wasn't over. I wasn't in an exit tunnel. The corridor was lined with doors, steel doors with small sliding viewports. I was in the sanatorium's psychiatric holding cells. And at the far end of the hall, the only other door, the exit to the outside, was welded shut.
The silence in the isolation ward was heavier than anywhere else in the hotel. After the roaring cacophony of the steam room, the sudden drop in decibels was disorienting, leaving my ears ringing with a phantom whine. I shone my light down the corridor. It was a tunnel of white subway tiles, now yellowed with nicotine and age. The floor was checkered linoleum, curling up at the edges like burnt paper. There were 10 doors, 5 on each side, heavy steel slabs with small reinforced glass viewports at eye level. I ran to the far end, to the double doors that should have led to the exterior ambulance bay. My hope died instantly. The seam between the doors was fused with a thick, jagged line of arc welding. It wasn't a recent job. The weld was rusted. This ward had been sealed off from the outside world years ago. I was trapped in a concrete box, and on the other side of the blast door behind me, the father was undoubtedly calling for backup. I had minutes, maybe seconds, before they found another way in. I needed a weapon. I needed a hiding spot. I needed a miracle. I started checking the cells. Cell 1 was empty, save for a rusted metal bed frame bolted to the floor. The walls were padded, but the leather had rotted away, leaving tufts of horsehair stuffing spilling out like entrails. Cell 2 was different. As I peered through the scratch-resistant glass, I saw a bucket in the corner and a pile of rags. The smell wafting through the gap under the door was distinct, feces and fear. This was a holding pen, a waiting room for the pantry I had seen in the boiler room. I moved faster, panic making my hands clumsy. Cell 3, Cell 4. Then I reached Cell 5. The door to Cell 5 wasn't locked. In fact, the locking mechanism had been removed entirely, leaving a jagged hole in the steel. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The beam of my flashlight revealed a scene that made my skin crawl more than the slaughterhouse downstairs. This wasn't a cell for a prisoner. It was a bedroom. But it was a bedroom designed by a nightmare. There was a mattress on the floor, covered in a patchwork quilt made from stolen hotel curtains. In the corner, there was a pile of toys, plastic trucks, action figures, dolls, all bleached from the sun and covered in grit. They were decades old. The walls were the worst part. They were covered in drawings, hundreds of them, drawn in crayon, marker, and what looked remarkably like charcoal from a fire. I stepped closer, illuminating the artwork. They were depictions of the hotel, crude, jagged renderings of the tower, and in every drawing there were stick figures, large black figures standing over smaller red figures. One drawing showed a stick figure falling from a roof. Another showed a figure trapped in a box. Another showed a figure being cut into pieces. This was the nursery. This was where the father had raised his sons. This was where he had taught them the family business. I backed away, revulsion churning in my gut. I turned to leave, to try and find a vent in the hallway, when my boot caught on the edge of the mattress. It shifted. Underneath the mattress, the linoleum floor had been cut away. I shoved the bedding aside. There, cut directly into the concrete foundation, was a jagged, dark hole. It wasn't part of the original building. It had been hammered out, chip by chip, likely over the course of years. It was a tunnel. It was narrow, barely wide enough for my shoulders, and angled sharply downward into the earth. A cool, damp draft flowed out of it, smelling of wet soil and sewage. Clang. The sound came from the hallway. I froze. It was the sound of the blast door, the one I had just escaped through, being unlatched. The electronic lock buzzed, a dying, wasp-like sound. The father had overridden the lock. I didn't hesitate. I dropped my legs into the hole in the floor. It was a tight squeeze. I had to extend my arms above my head to fit, sliding down into the darkness like a worm. As my head dipped below the level of the concrete floor, I heard the heavy steel door of Cell 5 creak open.
I held my breath, sliding further down, bracing my boots against the rough dirt walls of the tunnel to stop myself from sliding uncontrollably. I was now completely underground, beneath the foundation of the hotel. Above me, a circle of light appeared, the flashlight beam of the intruder cutting across the opening of the hole. "Silas?" The voice was soft, maternal. It was the mother. "Silas, are you in your room?" She walked into the cell. I could hear her heavy, lumbering footsteps on the linoleum. The floorboards creaked above my head. She was standing inches from the hole. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying she wouldn't look down. "He's not here, Father," she called out, her voice echoing slightly in the small room. "The bed is moved." There was a pause, then a heavy sigh. "Then he went into the rabbit hole." The father's voice boomed from the hallway. "He's in the drainage. He's going for the creek outflow." The mother made a low clicking sound with her tongue. "Shall I send Caleb?" "No," the father said. "Caleb is too big for the pipes. Send the dog." My blood turned to ice. The dog? I hadn't seen a dog. I hadn't heard a dog. Above me, I heard a metallic jingle, the sound of a chain collar. Then a sound that was distinctly not a dog. It was a human sound, a frantic, hyperventilating whimpering. "Go," whispered the mother. "Fetch!" Something scrambled into the hole above me. I let go of the walls. I slid. I tumbled down the steep dirt slope, sliding on my back, dirt and rocks raining down on my face. I slid for 20 feet before the tunnel leveled out and dumped me into a horizontal concrete tunnel. I splashed into freezing water. It was shin deep, rushing fast. I was in the hotel's storm drain system. I scrambled to my feet, shining my light down the round concrete tunnel. It stretched endlessly into the dark. Behind me, coming down the dirt slide, I heard the scrabbling. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It wasn't a dog, I knew that now. The dog was a person, a feral, broken human being they kept on a chain and used to hunt in tight spaces. I ran. I splashed through the water, hunched over in the 4-foot pipe, my backpack scraping the ceiling. The tunnel was a claustrophobic nightmare, slick with algae and smelling of rot. The thing behind me was fast. I could hear it splashing, gaining on me. It didn't bark, it hissed.
I saw a junction ahead. The pipe split left and right. I didn't know the layout. I didn't know which way led to the creek and which way led deeper into the mountain. Left, a voice in my head screamed. Left goes out. I banked left, slipping on the slime, catching myself on the curved wall. As I turned, I risked a glance backward. The beam of my flashlight caught the pursuer. It was a man, or it had been. He was naked, emaciated, running on all fours with unnatural speed. A heavy leather collar was locked around his neck, with a trailing length of broken chain. His eyes were wide white discs in the darkness, devoid of anything resembling humanity. He wasn't running to catch me. He was running to eat me. I scrambled around the bend, my breath tearing at my throat. The pipe began to slope upward. The water moved faster, fighting against me. Suddenly, the pipe ended. It didn't lead outside. It opened up into a large, square cistern, a collection pool for the storm water. The walls were sheer concrete, 20 feet high. Above, a metal grate covered the top, letting in the moonlight. I was at the bottom of a well. I spun around, aiming my light at the pipe I had just exited. The dog skidded to a halt at the mouth of the pipe. He crouched there, his pale skin glowing in the beam, vibrating with adrenaline. He bared his teeth, brown, jagged stumps. He didn't attack, he just sat there, blocking the exit. He threw his head back and let out a high, piercing shriek, a signal. He had treed the raccoon. Now he was waiting for the masters to come with the guns. I looked up at the grate 20 feet above. It was my only way out, but the walls were smooth, wet concrete. There was no ladder. Then I saw the roots. Thick, gnarled tree roots had burst through a crack in the concrete near the top of the cistern, hanging down like a rope ladder about 10 feet from the floor. If I could jump, if I could get enough height, I might be able to grab them. But to get the height, I needed to climb the pile of debris in the center of the room. I climbed the pile of driftwood and trash. I crouched, muscles coiled, eyeing the roots. The dog hissed and took a step into the water. I leaped.
My fingers closed around the wet, slimy wood of the roots just as gravity tried to claim me. The impact wrenched my shoulders, a sharp, tearing pain that shot down my spine, but my grip held. I swung wildly over the dark water, my boots kicking at empty air. Below me, the feral man, the dog, splashed into the center of the cistern, gnashing his teeth. He leaped, his dirty fingernails scraping the heel of my boot, missing my flesh by a fraction of an inch. I screamed, a primal, involuntary sound of exertion, and hauled myself up. I wasn't climbing, I was clawing. I jammed my toes into the cracks of the concrete wall, using the roots as a lifeline, inching my way toward the moonlight. The creature below shrieked, a sound of pure frustration, and began jumping repeatedly, snapping at the air like a starving wolf. I reached the grate. It was heavy cast iron, rusted into its frame. I shoved against it with my shoulder, screaming through the pain in my arm. It groaned, a screech of metal on metal that echoed loudly into the night and shifted just enough. I squeezed through the gap, scraping my chest raw, and rolled out onto the frozen earth. I didn't stop to rest. I scrambled to my feet, gasping in the bitter mountain air. I was soaking wet, shivering violently, and I was weaponless. I grabbed a fist-sized rock from the ground. Pathetic, I know, but it was all I had, and looked around. I was in the forest, about 100 yards behind the hotel. The Aethelgard loomed above me, a black monolith blocking out the stars. The cistern vent was located in a depression in the ground, hidden by a thicket of blackberry bushes. I was out, but I wasn't safe. I needed to get to my truck. It was 3 miles away, down the old logging road. If I could make it to the road, I could run. I turned away from the hotel and plunged into the tree line. The forest here was dense, a wall of Douglas firs and ancient cedars.
It was pitch black, the canopy blotting out the moon. I moved as fast as I could, stumbling over roots and crashing through ferns. My clothes were freezing solid, stiffening like armor against my skin. As I moved deeper into the woods, the liminal feeling returned. The trees were too perfectly spaced. The silence was too absolute. It felt like the forest itself was conspiring with the hotel, guiding me, channeling me. I had been walking for maybe 10 minutes when I saw a glint of metal ahead. I froze, ducking behind a tree. Was it them? Was it a trap? I waited. No movement, no flashlights, just the pale reflection of moonlight on chrome. I crept forward, the rock clutched in my freezing hand. The ground dipped into a large bowl-shaped ravine, and as I crested the ridge, I realized I hadn't found a way out. I had found the evidence. I was looking at a car graveyard. There were dozens of them, maybe 50. They were scattered throughout the ravine, parked haphazardly between the trees, covered in camouflage netting and pine boughs. I slid down the embankment, my boots crunching on the frost. I walked past a 1990s Honda Civic, its paint entirely consumed by moss. Next to it was a Ford Explorer, the tires flat and rotting into the earth. I wiped the frost off the window of a sedan. Inside it was packed with leaves. A tree sapling was growing through the floorboard. These were the cars of the missing, the urban explorers, the hikers, the lost tourists. The family didn't chop the cars. They hid them. They kept them. It was a museum of their kills. I moved deeper into the graveyard, a sick fascination taking hold. I saw license plates from Oregon, Washington, Idaho, California. Some were ancient, rusted rectangles of steel. Others were newer. Then, near the center of the ravine, I saw something that made my heart stop. It was a Jeep Wrangler, yellow, bright, cheerful yellow. It looked brand new. The tires were still inflated. The mud on the wheel wells was fresh. I ran to it. I tried the door. Locked.
I looked in the window. There was a coffee cup in the cup holder, a receipt on the dashboard, a pair of sunglasses on the passenger seat. This wasn't from years ago. This was from this week, maybe even today. Panic flared. If there was a fresh car, that meant there were fresh victims, or it meant the family was currently active in this area. I checked the ignition. No keys, of course. I turned to run, to get out of this ravine and find the road, when a sound cut through the silent woods. Click. It was the distinct mechanical sound of a high-powered flashlight being switched on. A beam of blinding white light exploded from the ridge above me, pinning me against the yellow Jeep. I threw my hands up to shield my eyes, stumbling back. "Don't move," a voice called out. It wasn't the father. It wasn't the guttural croak of the mother or the feral hiss of the sons. This voice was young, clear, human. "I have a rifle," the voice shouted, trembling slightly. "Step away from the vehicle." I squinted against the light. "Wait, don't shoot. I'm not with them." The light wavered. "Who are you?" "I'm an explorer," I yelled, my voice cracking. "I escaped the hotel. There are people living in there. They're hunting me." There was a pause. The light lowered slightly, revealing a figure standing on the ridge. It was a guy, maybe 25. He was wearing a North Face jacket and holding a hunting rifle. "My girlfriend," the guy shouted, panic edging into his tone. "She went inside to take pictures. She hasn't come back. Did you see a girl? Red hair?" My stomach dropped. The yellow Jeep, the receipt, the coffee. He was the boyfriend. He was waiting for her, and she was inside.
Listen to me, I said, stepping forward, my hands raised. You need to leave. We need to leave, right now. You can't help her, not with that gun, not alone. You don't understand, I pleaded, taking another step. It's a trap. The whole place is a... Thwip! It was a soft sound, like a finger snapping against a wet towel. The guy on the ridge jerked. His head snapped back violently, a mist of red spraying into the flashlight beam. He crumpled. He dropped like a sack of cement, tumbling down the embankment, rolling over the frost-covered leaves until he came to rest at my feet. The rifle landed a few feet away. I stared at him. There was a crossbow bolt protruding from his eye socket, fletched with dirty gray turkey feathers. I looked up at the ridge. The flashlight was still up there, lying on the ground where he had dropped it, the beam pointing uselessly into the trees. And stepping into the light, picking up the flashlight with a calm, practiced motion, was the father. He was wearing a heavy winter coat now. He held a compound crossbow in his other hand. He didn't look at the body. He looked at me. He raised the flashlight, shining it directly into my face again. You found the parking lot, he said, his voice carrying effortlessly in the cold air. Good. It saves us the trouble of moving the jeep. He cocked the crossbow. Run, rabbit. I'll give you a 10-second head start for the sport.
1. The number hung in the frozen air, white vapor drifting from the father's mouth. I didn't wait for 2. My survival instinct, sharpened by hours of terror, finally overrode my panic. I dropped to my knees, not in surrender, but to snatch the hunting rifle from the frost-covered leaves. My hands were numb blocks of ice, but I managed to curl my finger around the trigger guard. 2. I scrambled sideways, throwing myself behind the rotting chassis of the Ford Explorer just as the crossbow twanged. Thwack! The bolt slammed into the metal doorframe, inches from where my head had been a split second before. The steel groaned, the arrow vibrating with the force of the impact. He had lied. There was no 10-second head start. The game had started the moment I moved. I scrambled on all fours through the underbrush, clutching the rifle to my chest. I didn't know if the safety was on. I didn't know if there was a round in the chamber. I just knew that having it was the only reason I wasn't already dead. I wove through the aluminum graveyard, using the carcasses of the stolen cars as shields. Behind me, I heard the father moving. He wasn't running. He was walking with a heavy, deliberate pace, crunching through the bracken. He was reloading. "A gun makes you feel safe, doesn't it?" His voice floated through the trees, taunting, coming from everywhere and nowhere. "But do you have the nerve, little bird? Can you pull the trigger? My boys can." I reached a cluster of vehicles, a rusted pickup truck and a hatchback covered in a tarp. I pressed my back against the tire of the truck, gasping for air. My lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass. I looked down at the rifle. It was a Remington bolt action. I fumbled with the bolt, pulling it back slightly to check the chamber. Brass glinted in the moonlight. Loaded. I clicked the safety off. My hands were shaking so violently the barrel tapped against the truck tire. Click, click, click. To my left, a twig snapped. It wasn't the father. The sound was fast, skittering. I spun around, raising the rifle. Silas, the son with the limp, the one I had seen in the laundry room, lunged from the shadows of a moss-covered station wagon. He had a machete in his hand, a rusted blade that looked more like a saw. He wasn't screaming. He was grinning, his eyes wide and vacant. He closed the distance in a heartbeat, swinging the blade for my head. I didn't think. I squeezed the trigger. Crack! The gunshot was deafening, shattering the silence of the mountain. The muzzle flash blinded me for a second, a supernova in the dark.
Silas jerked backward as if he'd been yanked by a rope. The bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around. He slammed into the side of the station wagon and slid down, the machete clattering to the ground. He let out a high, keening wail, not of pain, but of shock. "Silas!" The roar came from the ridge, the father. The calm, playful tone was gone. This was pure, molten rage. I didn't wait to see if Silas was down for good. I scrambled up the embankment, my ears ringing, the smell of gunpowder mixing with the pine. I had hurt one of them. The rules of the hunt had changed. They wouldn't try to capture me anymore. They would just kill me.
I sprinted. I abandoned stealth. I crashed through the bushes, tearing my clothes on thorns, slipping on the icy mud. I needed to get to the logging road. It was uphill, a brutal incline that burned my thighs, but I knew the geography. The road was the perimeter. Flip! Pain exploded in my left thigh. It felt like being hit by a baseball bat. My leg buckled, and I face-planted into the dirt, the rifle flying from my hand and sliding down the slope. I rolled over, screaming through gritted teeth. A crossbow bolt was sticking out of my leg, just above the knee. It had gone through the muscle. I looked down the hill. The father was standing by the station wagon, illuminated by a patch of moonlight. He was reloading again, his movements jerky with anger. Next to him, the other son, Caleb, the feral one from the storm drain, was helping Silas up. They were a pack, and I was the wounded deer. I looked at the rifle. It was 10 feet away, down the slope. I looked up the hill. The tree line thinned out about 50 yards up, the road. If I went for the rifle, the father would put the next bolt in my chest. I left the gun. I clawed my way up the hill, dragging my useless left leg. Every movement spiked hot agony through my body, black spots dancing in my vision. I grabbed roots, rocks, saplings, anything to pull myself up. Behind me, the heavy boots of the father began to pound up the slope. He was running now. "I will skin you while you breathe," he screamed, his voice rapidly closing the distance. I reached the crest of the ravine. I pulled myself over the lip of the embankment and rolled onto gravel. The logging road. It was a strip of pale gray in the moonlight, cutting through the forest like a scar. I scrambled to my feet, putting my weight on my good leg, hopping and stumbling. My truck. Where was my truck? I looked left. Darkness. I looked right. There, about 100 yards down the road, sat my pickup. It was covered in frost, sitting exactly where I had left it hours ago. It looked like a spaceship, a beacon of civilization in this hell. I started to hobble toward it, my breath coming in ragged sobs. Keys, keys, keys! I patted my pockets frantically. My jacket pocket. I felt the jagged metal shape. I still had them. I heard the father crest the hill behind me. I heard his heavy breathing, the rattle of the crossbow. "You can't leave. We aren't done," he bellowed. I didn't look back. I focused on the tailgate of my truck. 50 yards, 30 yards. The air around my head whistled. Another bolt flew past my ear, striking a tree to my right with a hollow tuck. He was firing on the move, his aim thrown off by his rage. I reached the truck. I fumbled the key into the door lock, my hands slick with blood and sweat. Turn. Click. I yanked the door open and slammed the lock button down with my elbow before I even pulled my legs in. Thud. A heavy body slammed into the driver's side door just as I pulled it shut. The window shattered. A hand wrapped in leather punched through the safety glass, showering me in cubes of debris. A hand grabbed my collar. The father was hanging on to the door handle, his face pressed against the broken window. He wasn't human anymore. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, his teeth bared in a rictus of hate. Blood from the thorns smeared his forehead. He hauled himself up, reaching through the broken window to unlock the door.
I jammed the key into the ignition. Please start. Please start. The engine turned over. Click. The battery was cold. The father's hand found the lock pin. He pulled it up. He ripped the door open. The cold mountain air rushed into the cab, bringing with it the smell of the father, oatmeal, old blood, and unwashed skin. He reached for me, his fingers closing around my throat, squeezing with the strength of a hydraulic press. I turned the key again. Vroom! The engine roared to life. I didn't put it in drive, I put it in reverse. I stomped on the gas pedal. The truck lurched backwards, the tires spinning on the gravel before catching traction. The open door acted as a scoop. It caught the father, slamming into his chest, knocking him off balance. He didn't let go of my throat. He was being dragged, his boots scraping sparks against the gravel road, his eyes locked onto mine, choking the life out of me as the truck accelerated backwards towards the drop-off of the ravine.
The truck screamed in reverse, the tires spitting gravel like shrapnel. The father held on, his face a mask of bloody determination, his fingers digging into my windpipe so hard I could feel the cartilage shifting. My vision began to tunnel, the edges turning gray. I didn't have a plan. I just had terror at a heavy metal door swinging in the wind. I saw a flash of white in the side mirror, a thick, gnarled birch tree standing right at the edge of the logging road. I yanked the steering wheel hard to the left. The truck fishtailed, the rear end swinging violently toward the tree line. Crunch! The sound was sickening. The open driver's door caught the trunk of the birch tree at 40 miles an hour. Metal screamed as the door was bent all the way back, snapping the hinges like twigs. The impact ripped the father away from me. I heard a wet thud, then the sound of something heavy rolling into the ditch. The pressure on my throat vanished instantly. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt in a cloud of dust. I shifted into drive, my hands shaking so badly I missed the gear twice. I didn't look back to see if he was moving. I didn't care. I floored it. The truck roared down the mountain, missing a door, the cold wind blasting into the cab, freezing the blood on my face. I drove like a maniac, drifting around the switchbacks, the headlights cutting through the darkness. Every shadow looked like a man, every branch looked like a reaching hand. I didn't stop until I reached the highway. I pulled into a 24-hour truck stop, collapsed out of the cab, and screamed for help until a trucker ran over and saw the crossbow bolt sticking in my thigh. The next 48 hours were a blur of surgery, painkillers, and police interviews. At first, the sheriff's deputies didn't believe me. A family of cannibals living in the walls of the Aethelgard? It sounded like a drug-induced hallucination. Then they found the crossbow bolt. It was handmade, the shaft whittled from scrap wood, the tip a sharpened piece of rebar. That was enough to get a warrant. A multi-agency task force raided the Aethelgard Resort 3 days later. They went in with SWAT teams, canine units, and thermal imaging. They found everything. They found the pantry in the sub-basement. They found the nursery with the drawings. They found the ravine filled with 43 vehicles, some dating back to the late 1980s. They found the bodies of the boyfriend and the girl in the yellow Jeep, along with dozens of unidentified remains in the cistern. But they didn't find the family. The warren, the network of tunnels beneath the foundation, didn't just stop at the storm drain. It connected to an abandoned mine shaft that ran deep into the Cascades, a labyrinth of miles and miles of unmapped darkness. The father, the mother, Caleb, and the wounded Silas. They were gone. They had vanished into the veins of the mountain, taking their tools and their rage with them. It's been 6 months since I left the Aethelgard. I live in Seattle now. I live in a modern apartment building on the 15th floor. It has security cameras, key fob entry, and 24-hour doormen. I don't go camping. I don't go hiking. I don't even like being in parks after sunset. I thought I was safe. I thought I had left the horror 3 hours east in the mountains. But last week, the police called me. They had finished processing the evidence from the boiler room. They were returning my personal effects. I went to the station to pick up my backpack. My wallet was there, my keys, and my camera. The detective looked at me with a strange expression when he handed me the DSLR. "We developed the photos on the card," he said quietly. "Most of them were yours, the lobby, the pool, the hallways." He paused, sliding a manila envelope across the desk. "But the last 3 photos, the timestamps indicate they were taken while you were being chased, after you lost the camera in the boiler room." I opened the envelope. My hands were trembling. The first photo was a blurry shot of the boiler room floor. The father must have accidentally hit the shutter when he picked it up. The second photo was a picture of me. It was taken from the ridge in the ravine, zoomed in. It showed me crouched behind the Ford Explorer, terrified, holding the rifle. The father had taken a picture of me before he started counting. He was playing with me. But it was the third photo that made my blood run cold. It was a photo of a building. It wasn't the Aethelgard. It was a brick apartment building with a fire escape. I recognized the street. I recognized the coffee shop on the corner. It was my apartment building in Seattle. The timestamp was from 2 days ago. I stared at the photo, the room spinning. They weren't in the mountains anymore. The mine shafts didn't just go deep, they went far. Or maybe they just drove. Maybe they took one of those 43 cars and followed the prey home. I went back to my apartment that night. I locked the deadbolt. I wedged a chair under the handle. But as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I heard it. It was faint. So faint you would miss it if you weren't listening for it. Scrape. Scrape. It was coming from inside the wall behind my headbed. I put my ear against the plaster. I heard a sound, a soft, rhythmic breathing, and then a whisper, dry, raspy, and terrifyingly close. "I hear his heart, Daddy. I hear his heart."